A mother's silent breaking point never arrives with thunder. It builds like pressure beneath the earth, slow, crushing, invisible, until one day the ground simply opens, swallowing everything that once stood on it. For years, she absorbed her son's disrespect like a sponge forced under a faucet. She let the harsh tones slide off her back. She let the slammed doors echo through the hallways without reacting. She told herself he was stressed, that adulthood was heavy on his shoulders, that he would soften with time. She swallowed her own pain to protect him, believing that if she gave just a little more love, a little more patience, he would remember who she was. But the truth was far darker. Every time she stayed silent, every time she forgave too quickly, she was training him to believe she would tolerate anything. She wasn't raising a man, she was feeding a monster. Her son was not born cruel. Cruelty crept in slowly, disguised as frustration wrapped in entitlement. He grew, and with each passing year, he discovered new ways to twist the knife, not physically, not at first. He learned the art of belittling her, the tone that made her shrink, the words that made her feel small in her own home. He learned he could scare her with volume, break her with silence, manipulate her with guilt. And she let it happen, because mothers are conditioned to believe they must endure everything for their children. She carried his burdens, excused his failures, and overlooked the venom in his voice. She told herself it was a phase. But phases do not last for years. Phases do not look you dead in the eyes and tell you that you are worthless. The night he hit her was not a storm, it was a culmination. It didn't happen because he snapped. It happened because he felt entitled to. Because he believed, truly believed, that she would take it, that she would cry and then clean up after him like she always had. He didn't see the trembling hands that no longer trembled from fear but from something far more dangerous awakening. He didn't notice the moment the light went out of her eyes. Not because she was broken, but because she had finally reached the threshold beyond which no mother's love can survive unscathed. He struck her with the arrogance of someone who thought he owned the home, the air, the silence. And when she fell, when her cheek burned, when the room spun, she realized something horrifying. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't devastated. She wasn't even heartbroken. She was done, completely, utterly, irreversibly done. That moment, the sting of his hand against her face, wasn't the pain that broke her. What broke her was the realization that she had enabled this cruelty by sacrificing herself at the altar of motherhood for too long. It was the moment she truly saw the boy she had raised and recognized a stranger. It was the moment she understood that protecting him meant destroying herself. And for the first time in decades, she chose herself. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't retaliate. She simply looked at him, not the way a mother looks at a child, but the way a survivor looks at their captor. Calm, cold, detached. That look unsettled him more than any slap could have. He stormed out of the house, expecting her to wilt, to retreat into her room, to crumble. But he walked away from a version of her that no longer existed. The woman he left behind was not going to bow again. When the door slammed behind him, the silence that filled the home was not empty. It was electric, purposeful. She pressed her fingers to her cheek and felt no sorrow, only clarity. Years of humiliation, manipulation, and disrespect lined up in her memory like soldiers waiting for orders. She didn't sob. She didn't collapse. She stood up straight for the first time in her life, not physically but internally. She made tea with steady hands, sat at the dining table, and stared at the wall as if seeing it for the first time. Her mind was sharp, painfully sharp, and in that razor-edge clarity, she understood what must happen next. Revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it cooks dinner. And that night, as the kettle boiled and the clock ticked, she crafted every step of her transformation with the precision of someone who has finally reclaimed her power. She decided she would no longer be the mother who absorbed harm like a shield. She would become the woman who returned consequences like a mirror. She realized something else too. Forgiveness had turned into a chain around her neck, and chains, once noticed, are impossible to ignore. She remembered every bruise on her heart that never showed on her skin, every insult he had tossed like scraps to a dog, every moment she had shrunk so he could feel tall. And with each memory, the chain loosened, link by link, until it snapped. By the time dawn touched the windows, she was no longer the woman who went to sleep the night before. She stood in the kitchen with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Her heart was not soft anymore, it was steel. Her spine was not bent anymore, it was straight. She knew the world would not understand a mother turning against her child. But she also knew the world had not lived in her shoes, had not begged silently for respect, had not been struck by the person she gave life to. Her silent breaking point was not an end. It was a beginning. The birth of a woman who had finally reclaimed her dignity. A woman who had finally understood that loyalty without boundaries is self-destruction. A woman who would no longer allow blood to excuse cruelty. She had reached the point of no return, and for the first time in years, she felt alive. She felt powerful. She felt free. And as the sun rose, one truth crystallized in her mind like a blade. He thought the slap made her weak. But it was the very moment she became unstoppable. The house had never looked like that. Not in years, not under the weight of arguments, slammed doors, and emotional wreckage that he had scattered through every room like a storm. When he walked back inside the next day, he expected chaos, expected to find his mother huddled in a corner or silently sweeping away her tears like she always did. He expected resentment, fear, apology, anything that proved she was still under his thumb. But instead, he stepped into a home that looked disturbingly perfect. The floors gleamed as if polished by invisible hands. The air felt colder, cleaner, sharper. The kitchen counters sparkled, every item placed precisely where it belonged. Even the living room, once buried under his mess, his habits, his dominance, looked like a photograph torn from a magazine. It was intentional cleanliness, the kind that didn't whisper obedience, but screamed calculation. He paused at the doorway. Something felt wrong, terrifyingly wrong. He tried to convince himself the spotless house was proof that his lesson had worked, that the slaps he gave her had forced her to behave the way he wanted. There was arrogance in his smirk, satisfaction in the nod he gave himself. But beneath that shallow pride, a faint unease started curling inside him like smoke. Because deep down, even in his coldest moments, he knew his mother. She was gentle, emotional, reactive. She cried loudly, forgave easily, and cleaned only when pushed. But this wasn't cleaning. This was staging. This was preparation. This was the eerie calm before something seismic. Every step he took deeper into the home echoed in a way that made his skin crawl. The silence wasn't weak. It wasn't scared. It was deliberate, controlled, dominant. The silence wasn't hers. It was something she had created for him. And the house itself felt like it had turned against him, like it had been waiting for him, like every polished surface, every neatly stacked plate, every perfectly aligned chair was part of a message he hadn't yet deciphered. He moved through the rooms with a rising discomfort, touching things that suddenly felt foreign. His jacket, once tossed carelessly on a chair, was folded neatly. His muddy footprints near the door were gone. The cigarette burn on the table had been sanded and treated. The dents from doors he'd slammed were filled in and repainted. It was as if the house had been rewritten, scrubbed of the history of his violence, purified of his presence. As if his mother was preparing the home for a future that no longer included him. He muttered under his breath, irritation mixing with confusion. The spotless shine of everything made him feel exposed, examined, judged by the very walls. Something in his chest tightened. He didn't recognize this version of the home. It didn't feel weak anymore. It felt powerful. It felt like a witness waiting to testify. Then he saw the dining table. It was set with perfection: candles, silverware, glasses sparkling like crystal. His favorite meal was covered neatly with lids, steam barely fogging the edges. It looked like a celebration dinner, a peaceful gathering, a mother's attempt to keep the family together. But the longer he stared at it, the more wrong it felt. His mother didn't host dinners. She didn't set tables with ceremony. She didn't create scenes that looked like the final act of a movie. The table wasn't an invitation. It was a statement, and suddenly he felt something unfamiliar, fear. Because he realized that everything in this room, everything in the house, was not a sign of submission. It was a sign of someone who had made a decision. Someone who had prepared. Someone who had stopped reacting and started planning. The spotless floor wasn't clean. It was symbolic, like erasing footprints before walking away forever. The polished silverware wasn't for dinner, it was for presentation, for closure. The scent of lemon in the air wasn't refreshing, it was the smell of transformation, of a woman reclaiming her space. His mind tried to fight against the truth forming like a storm cloud, but there was no escaping it. He had not come home to a frightened woman. He had come home to a woman who had reached her limit and stepped beyond it. He had walked into a house that was no longer his battlefield, but her arena. The perfect environment suffocated him with its calm. There was no panic here, no anxiety, no sign of someone who feared him. And that terrified him more than any scream or accusation ever could. Because when someone stops crying, stops fighting, stops explaining, that is when you should fear them the most. The house was her message, clean, cold, controlled, a declaration that she had finally understood her worth, and that he had no place in it. And he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that whatever came next would not be something he could stop. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the predator, he was the prey. The table gleamed under the soft candlelight. At first glance, it looked like warmth, like a mother's attempt to patch up a broken relationship, to extend an olive branch after a night of violence. But there was nothing warm about this dinner. It was a ceremony, a farewell, a final chapter disguised as a meal. And the moment he sat down and looked across the table at her, he understood that this was not a celebration for him. It was a celebration of her freedom. She wasn't wearing sadness. She wasn't wearing fear. She was calm, disturbingly calm. The kind of calm that only arrives when a person has already made peace with the consequences of their decision. Her posture was straight, her eyes steady, her hands relaxed. It was the posture of someone who had stepped beyond pain and into purpose. And that terrified him more than any argument ever could. Because he knew, without her saying a word, that she was no longer his mother in the way she used to be. She wasn't the woman who bent to accommodate his storms. She was the storm now. He tried to speak, to comment on the meal, to regain some sense of control, but his voice faltered. There was something in the air, something heavy, decisive, final. The atmosphere felt like the moment before a judge reads a verdict. Every flicker of the candlelight seemed to underline the reality that this was not reconciliation, this was revelation. She slid an envelope across the table, a simple, plain envelope. But the moment it touched his fingers, his heart tightened. It felt too light, too quiet, too intentional. His stomach churned with an instinctive dread, the kind a person feels when they know the truth inside the envelope is going to change everything. Inside were documents, legal documents, signed, sealed, completed. Her signature appeared over and over again, each stroke stronger than the last. She had filed reports. She had transferred accounts. She had changed locks. She had removed his name from things he thought he owned control over. She had contacted people, professionals, authorities, advocates, people who had listened to her story and given her tools she never knew she had the right to use. Every page was a step away from him. Every signature was a severed tie. Every legal stamp was a nail in the coffin of the power he thought he still held over her. He flipped page after page, his breathing growing heavier, the walls tightening around him. The celebration was not a celebration of obedience. It was a celebration of liberation. The dinner was not for him. It was her final meal in a house she had reclaimed. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. She wasn't getting ready to leave. She was getting ready to start over, without him. The realization struck him with the force of a collapsing world. He had believed that hitting her made him powerful. He had believed she would break. He had believed she would bow. But the slap didn't destroy her, it awakened her. And now she wasn't just stepping out of his shadow. She was dragging every ounce of his control into the light. She lifted her glass, not in affection, not in celebration, but in closure. A quiet toast to the woman she had become. A quiet death to the version of her he once controlled. A quiet beginning to his downfall. The celebration had a hidden meaning. Yes, it was the ceremony of her freedom, and the funeral of his dominance. And for the first time in his life, he understood something chilling. She hadn't taken revenge with violence. She had taken revenge with truth. And truth was far deadlier. A son who believes he still has power walks with a specific kind of arrogance, a swagger built not on strength, but on the illusion of dominance he has rehearsed for years. When he returned to the house the next day, confidence pulsed through him like poison. He believed he had won. He believed those slaps, those brutal, shameful blows he delivered to the woman who gave him life, had fixed her. In his mind, fear was obedience, silence was submission, and a clean house was proof that she had finally learned her place. He strutted through the doorway like a victor returning from battle, convinced that his mother had shattered and reassembled herself according to his expectations. That belief, that grotesque certainty, was the foundation of his imagined power, and it was about to crumble beneath him. He expected her to be trembling, teary, apologetic. He expected the fear in her eyes to validate his control. But the moment he stepped inside, the air shifted. The house felt different, unnervingly different. It wasn't just clean. It was curated. It was controlled. It was intentional. It felt like a stage, and he was the only actor who didn't know his lines. But blind to danger, blinded by ego, he didn't sense the trap tightening around him. Instead, he mistook the silence for victory. He mistook the calm for obedience. He mistook the coolness in the room for the aftermath of his anger, not the prelude to hers. He carried his arrogance like armor, but it was thin and brittle, made of cheap metal that would snap under real pressure. Everything inside him, every ounce of misplaced confidence, stemmed from years of testing her boundaries and never facing consequences. He believed she was incapable of standing up to him. He believed she was too soft, too emotional, too fragile. He believed he was untouchable. That belief kept him blind. That belief kept him vulnerable. That belief kept him walking straight into a reckoning he could have never predicted. He glanced at her as she stood by the table, composed, steady, almost serene. But instead of recognizing the danger in her stillness, he misinterpreted it as fear. He thought he had broken her. He thought she had shrunk into a version of herself that fit his control. He didn't understand that she wasn't shrinking. She was settling into a power he had never seen before. A quiet, coiled power that made the air crackle, a warning he was too arrogant to hear. Arrogance blinds more effectively than darkness. He didn't see the shift in her eyes. He didn't see the firmness in her jaw. He didn't see the resolve in her spine. He saw only what he wanted to see: a mother who had fallen back in line. That is the danger of abusers. They mistake silence for defeat. They mistake stillness for surrender. And he mistook the entire atmosphere around him for confirmation of his superiority. If he had listened, really listened, he would have heard something strange. The silence didn't tremble. It throbbed. It carried weight. It carried intention. It carried the finality of someone who had crossed the threshold of fear and walked into clarity. If he had looked closely, he would have seen that the table setting wasn't an apology, it was a preparation. If he had paid attention, he would have realized the chilling truth. He wasn't returning to dominate someone. He was returning to face someone who had finally awakened. But he was too intoxicated by his own ego to realize it. His power, the power he clung to so desperately, wasn't power at all. It was permission. It existed because she allowed it, tolerated it, survived it. And now that she had withdrawn that permission, he was standing on nothing. But he didn't know that. Not yet. He still believed he owned the room. He still believed he could raise his voice and watch her crumble. He still believed his presence alone meant control, He didn't realize that something far more dangerous had been happening behind the scenes. She had started thinking, planning, preparing. He believed he was the predator walking into familiar territory. In reality, he was stepping into the center of a trap crafted with intelligence, patience, and years of swallowed pain. He believed fear had fixed her. In reality, fear had freed her from hope, freed her from hesitation, freed her from loyalty to someone who had never earned it. He didn't notice how different her breathing was, not shallow, but steady. He didn't notice the absence of flinching when he moved closer. He didn't notice the stillness in her hands, which used to tremble under pressure but now rested calmly on the tablecloth. He didn't notice that she did not avoid his gaze. She met it, and that alone should have shattered the illusion he held so tightly, but arrogance is a blinding disease. He believed she was the same woman he had struck. But she wasn't. That woman had died in the moment he raised his hand against her. The person standing before him now was someone he had never met, a woman who had nothing left to lose. A woman who had discovered the lethal strength of her own silence. A woman who understood that power doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stop begging. And she had stopped begging. He walked deeper into the house, still believing he held the upper hand. He didn't know he was already standing on the edge of a cliff. He didn't know she had spent the night rebuilding herself from the inside out, piece by piece, breath by breath, until she rose stronger than she had ever been. He didn't know that while he slept comfortably, assuming victory, she had been sharpening truth into a weapon no abuser could survive. He still believed he had power because he hadn't yet seen the truth. He hadn't yet seen the documents. He hadn't yet heard the decisions she had made. He hadn't yet realized that the fear he relied on had evaporated. But he would, and when he did, the shock would be catastrophic, because there is no fall more devastating, no collapse more brutal than the moment an abuser realizes the person they thought they controlled has risen above them and is about to end everything they built their arrogance on. He walked in believing he was in charge. He didn't know he was walking into the first moment of his downfall, and nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The moment of revelation did not arrive with thunder, it arrived with silence so heavy it pressed down on his lungs. He sat across from his mother at the perfectly set table, still clinging to the fading illusion of dominance, unaware that the ground beneath him was already splitting apart. But then she reached for the envelope. A simple, small, unassuming envelope, the kind that carries either life-changing news or the final blow. She slid it toward him with a calmness that didn't match the storm she had endured the night before. And the second his fingers touched it, something deep within him trembled, a primal instinct whispering that he had stepped into a moment he could not escape. He opened it slowly at first, trying to maintain the facade of control. But with each unfolded sheet, his bravado crumbled. His face drained of color as he skimmed through the first page, then the next, then the next. They weren't threats. They weren't warnings. They were decisions. Completed, irreversible decisions. Signed, stamped, finalized. Every page was a door closing in his face. Every signature was a line drawn in permanent ink. Every legal seal was a blow to the chest, knocking the air out of the arrogance he carried so proudly. He felt his heartbeat stutter. The room tilted. The candlelight flickered over his mother's expression, calm, resolved, unmoving, and suddenly he realized she no longer feared him. And that terrified him in ways he had never imagined. Fear was his currency. Fear was his weapon. Fear was the rope he had used to keep her bound to him. But now, staring at the contents of that envelope, he understood something far more brutal. She had cut the rope while he slept, and she was watching him fall. There were police reports. Dates, times, photographs, documentation of every bruise, every threat, every manipulative outburst he thought she would never dare expose. There were statements from neighbors who had heard the shouts. Statements from professionals who had spoken to her that morning, while he was still smirking at himself in the mirror, convinced he controlled her world. There were copies of locks changed, financial accounts separated, emergency contacts updated. There were referrals, numbers, protective measures, and arrangements he had no power to disrupt. His name, the name he believed carried weight in her life, appeared only in one category: restricted. He tried to speak, but his throat closed up, his jaw clenched, his hands shook, not with anger, but with the horrifying understanding that the leash he thought he held was nothing but a thread that had finally snapped. The mother he had controlled, manipulated, and diminished had built an entire fortress behind his back, brick by brick, while he lived comfortably in the illusion of his own authority. She had taken everything he used against her, his violence, his cruelty, his entitlement, and documented it all with terrifying precision. She hadn't hidden anymore. She hadn't minimized anymore. She had told the truth, a truth he could not drown with shouting, a truth he could not slap out of her hands, a truth that carried the weight of law, of consequences, of accountability. For the first time in his life he felt small, powerless, cornered. He felt the walls of the spotless house pushing in on him, suffocating him with the reality that he was no longer the tyrant, he was the accused, the judged, the one whose actions had been meticulously prepared for exposure. His world shifted violently. His mind raced, trying to grasp control, but every angle was sealed, every escape route blocked. She had done something he never expected. She had stopped hoping he would change, and instead prepared for a future where he held no power over her. And that preparation was flawless. He stared at her, searching for weakness, for fear, for hesitation. But there was none. She met his gaze without blinking, without shrinking, without apologizing. Her silence was no longer the silence of a victim, it was the silence of a judge delivering a life sentence. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten him. She didn't need to justify anything. The document spoke for her. The truth spoke for her. The years of endurance now stood against him with the cold clarity of justice. He felt his stomach twist as the final page slid loose in his trembling fingers. It wasn't just evidence. It was a declaration, a message carved in ink and resolve. You no longer own any part of my life. That hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. He froze, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. Because for the first time, he saw the woman he had underestimated rise into her full power. And he realized that he had never been the strong one. His strength had always been borrowed from her fear, from her silence, from her love. Now that she had withdrawn it, he was nothing but a weak, desperate boy with no control left to cling to. He remained frozen not just in shock, but in helplessness. The revelation didn't just shake him, it shattered him. The house around him suddenly felt unfamiliar, hostile, unwelcoming. He wasn't the king here. He wasn't even a guest, he was an intruder, confronted by the consequences he never believed she would deliver. And as he sat there, still as a statue, gasping for breath that would not come, one truth echoed through his skull. He hadn't prepared her for obedience. She had prepared him for downfall. Revenge is often imagined as a blaze, a storm, a scream. A slap returned with greater force. But the most devastating revenge is quiet, controlled, legal, calculated, the kind of revenge that doesn't bruise the skin but crushes the ego. The kind of revenge that makes a person face the consequences they never believed would reach them. And she delivered exactly that. Without lifting a hand, without raising her voice, without giving him a single weapon to twist back on her. Her final strike was not chaotic. It was surgical. Every choice she made, every document signed, every step taken had been crafted with precision. She didn't want him hurt, she wanted him held accountable. She wanted him to feel the weight of every action he had dismissed as harmless. She wanted him to understand that the woman he had mocked, belittled, and struck had found strength far greater than his rage, the strength of truth paired with unwavering resolve. She didn't need to break him physically. She broke him with the undeniable reality that he could no longer touch her, not emotionally, not financially, not legally. She had insulated her life from his influence with the same care a warrior uses to sharpen their blade. and that final strike cut deeper than any slap he had ever thrown. Her revenge was not loud because loudness is temporary. Her revenge was not violent because violence is weak. Her revenge was quiet because quiet is permanent. Quiet lingers. Quiet forces reflection. Quiet exposes monsters to themselves. She gave him the one thing he never wanted to face: a mirror. A mirror that showed him exactly who he was. A mirror that showed what he had become. A mirror he could no longer escape or deny, because the world, through her reports, her documentation, her witnesses, now saw the same reflection. She didn't strip away his power. He had never truly had power. She simply removed the illusion. She didn't take revenge with fists. She took revenge with freedom. Her freedom was the final strike. Her independence was the final blow. Her peace was the final punishment. And he felt it, deep, crushing, unavoidable. For the first time, he faced a consequence that could not be shouted down, manipulated away, or ignored. She had risen, and he could not follow. She had healed, and he could not control. She had chosen herself, and that choice was the blade that severed every chain he thought he could bind her with. Her revenge was not an explosion. It was an execution, silent, precise, complete. Because the quiet ones, the ones who endure, who think, who plan, are always the most dangerous.